Hey there, Blockhead Traders. Here at Blockhead Traders must inform you that we are not financial professionals. Nothing we say should be considered financial advice. We offer our own thoughts and opinions to you, the viewer. We expect you to take these opinions, form your own financial conclusions, and make your own financial decisions. This is Blockhead Traders for the week of July 20th, 2025, and in this week's episode, I'm joined by fellow Blockhead Trader Viper XL 007. In this week's episode, we are going to take a look at another experimental strategy by Viper. He is constantly testing the experimental waters to see what's interesting to him, and I believe he has a few of these trades under his belt, and it has to do with the SPY, which is the S&P Index Fund, and it is a pretty robotic and mechanical strategy, and we're going to talk through it in this week's episode and see how it's going for Viper and see what he's learned and see what he's hoping to gain in the coming weeks. But before we hop to that, I want to give a shout out to our Discord, a link in the description below. You can hop in there, say hello to myself, Viper, some of the other Blockhead traders. Love to hear what you're trading, love to hear what type of content you want to hear about. Also, you can find a link to thetagang.com/sprocket888, where I post each and every one of my equity trades, the good, the bad, and the ugly. You can also look up /ViperXL007 as he has joined the Theta Gang party. Lastly, this is available in an audio-only format wherever you get your podcasts, so look us up, subscribe, and if you can't find it there, let us know, and we will get it there. But let's hop to this week's content. Viper, I feel that you're after a more mechanical strategy, and you were really kind of coming up there with your earnings strategy as we were running through the last earnings season, where you were kind of selling calendar spreads. You were trying them in different directions. You were trying them at different strikes. And I think we're kind of in a little bit of a holding pattern before the next earnings season really kind of kicks off. And I think while you were kind of out there in this holding pattern, waiting for the next earnings season, which, by the way, really starts ramping up in about a week from today, I think you kind of stumbled across maybe this very short duration SPY trade. Is that kind of what led us up to this latest experiment from the Viper Labs?
The Viper Hard Hat Lab. Watch your head. It's a low bridge getting in here. Essentially, yes. And there is a little bit more color to it. So, like you said, well, like you've always said, like we said about earnings, is like it comes in waves. It does last. Earnings season does last a wider period of time because it's not like 1 week that everybody does it. So some of it was filling that gap of, all right, wanting some sort of mechanical, systematic approach, but also wanting it to continue and not be so seasonal, which I believe is where some of your other strategies come in that aren't earnings focused. So trying to fill in that gap a little bit. The other piece of it is, I'll just brush on this topic, and as we get into the next earnings season, we'll definitely have more of a discussion around it. The calendar spread, obviously, it's for unknown reasons. It tends to interest me more. I still can't put my finger on it, but it appeals to me, and so I'm continuing to experiment with it, learn about it, and one thing that I'm learning about it in the earnings season is, Rocket's age-old liquidity is king. And there's just, we're going to see how next earnings season goes next week. But I'm worried that I'm just not as profitable as consistently as I want to be with the earnings strategy. And I think some of it has to do with liquidity, and specifically how liquidity fills for a more complex order like a calendar spread. And even though I'm now on a better broker for options, as previously discussed, I do want to give that new, more options focused broker a chance with the next earnings season. So I'm going to tough it out and see what happens. But ultimately, I came across this SPY strategy. It's meant to be, I believe it was called an income strategy. So it's not meant to be like, oh, you're going to do this and like you're going to hit this huge banger and it's just going to be major. No, this is a daily trade. and it's meant to just be pecking away and just, chip, 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 and steadily so. So, the first couple times I took it was when the whole liquidity thing really hit me, where I was like, man, just like, I don't know. There were so many options. There were so many earnings trades where, it felt like a coin toss. And again, some of this goes to the broker, but I think some of it is just going to always be there due to the nature of the underlying. But every morning after an earnings trade with the calendar spread, like, man, it just felt like a coin toss of where the value in that spread was going to be. Now, obviously, some of that is also due to the massive volatility that happens around earnings events. So there's a lot at play here. But the point was with this SPY strategy, it was like, it looks like there's a big move on SPY or something, and the type of move that I'd be dreading market open and the pricing of my options, and all of a sudden market opens and it's just, in profit, a little move up, or, the spread is still super tight because we're talking about the SPY. We're talking about a major index here. And so that was, just sort of like felt like I had more reliability backing the trade because of how strong that liquidity is on SPY. So everything you said, but also there is this element of, it's pretty nice to play in a very liquid pool.
So you have noticed a liquidity difference so far. I don't know how many trades you've made with your new broker, but you have noticed a liquidity difference?
So the short answer is yes. There was a liquidity difference with a couple of the earnings trades I took, but the trades still were pretty rough on profitability. But it was at least made more sense when I took a loss. So that part I've definitely noticed it. But also for the SPY trade, the better feeling of better liquidity is when dealing with SPY in any context. It's so much more liquid. It's just a smoother experience, I guess, is what I'm feeling for the draw here to the SPY trade.
Yeah, if you're comparing SPY liquidity to any individual underlying, save for maybe Nvidia or Tesla might have enough liquidity and volume to kind of compete a little bit with SPY, but yeah, it's I think it's kind of like the difference between some of the charts that you do in crypto land, where they're all kind of slicey and are very smooth compared to the slicey and dicey of open and close, where the liquidity in SPY is unmatched.
Yeah. And then also, I mean, it just kind of feels like, especially from the options perspective, like, because options are so heavily dependent on liquidity, much more so. I mean, buying and selling stocks, that needs liquidity. But in the options world, the pricing is so tight and it matters so much to the liquidity. Like, it just feels like you're driving a high performance machine when you're doing options on the SPY versus an individual underlying.
So Viper, what is this new trade that you've kind of been after? Like, what's the entry point? What's the exit strategy? And what's kind of the objective?
So this is where, again, I mean, I sound like a broken record, but this is where I just can't overstate the importance of what we always say about learning and growing here and in the market. And, this whole tick of a calendar spread that's been growing, and just consuming different, YouTube channels and whatnot. Obviously everybody's favorite watching this one, but, so I came across this SPY trade, like I said, and some certain things about it really immediately clicked for me because of my previous experience with the calendar spread. And so some of that is to say, again, I guess, like, anytime I go into any of this, like, I'm still learning, and neither of us are experts in anything. But if any of it goes over your head, like, there's an underlying meaning, there's an underlying message here of exploration and being willing to risk mitigate exposure to new things to find the hook. It's the everlasting quest of finding my hook. So what this trade does is It is a very defined trade. And so, I mean, which I feel like a lot of calendar spreads are, but you, you obviously, this is a long call calendar spread. So I'm going to sell a short option, and then I'm going to buy a long option, same strike, and with a time difference between them. That's the horizontal spread of a calendar spread. And in this particular case, um, it's always going to be next day expiration. So 1 DTE on the short option and essentially 8 DTE on the long that I'm going to buy. And so that's a 1 week. It's 1 week calendar spread, and it's always the very next day, and it's always 8 days later. And those are the two dates, the two contracts. And then additionally, I open that up in like the last 15 minutes of the market. So it's just before the bell closes on the day before expiration of that short option. And some of that is intentional to the goals of the strategy. But also one of the big things that really helps with is we kind of briefly talked about this before with my old brokerage, but also just in general with the earnings trades on those contracts on the earnings calendar spreads. Is there was an early assignment risk with some of those earnings trades, like it would gap super heavy, and the earnings setup is to go the next available expiration for the stock. So those all had early assignment risk to them. So part of the strategy here is we're going right at close. We're always going right at the money, and then 1 DTE and 8 DTE. So I would say there's never a 0% chance of anything, but I mean, I'll get your take on this statement. I would say there's a fairly 0.001% chance of early assignment selling an at the money 1 DTE SPY option. Would you say that seems to check out?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, your assignment risk will basically be that 1 day you have the option open, because I think, do you close both of them the following day?
Yes. Yeah. They both close. So it'll either expire worthless or it's closed. So if it's in the money, we close it. But if it's out of the money, then there's the option to let it expire worthless.
Yep. It's probably maybe a 1% chance of an early assignment, because basically anybody that is holding that option on, let's say you do it on a Thursday, that Thursday they have up to 15 minutes, I believe, 10 or 15 minutes after market close to say they want to exercise the option. But then after that period is closed, they can't say that they want to exercise it again until the market opens the next day. And even if they say they want to exercise it, let's say the market opens and they say exercise my option, that won't actually exercise until the close of the market on that Friday night. So if you end up selling to close that day or buying to close because you're short, then you would be out and you would face no assignment risk. So your only assignment risk is that 30-minute window that you're short on that very first day of ownership. And because you're going at the money, there is really a very low assignment risk.
Yeah. So that was motivation number one. And again, and this is, I mean, motivation of the strategy of who it was explaining it. So, and that's, I mean, yeah, it's a risk mitigation technique, but it's also, assignment's not the worst thing on a calendar spread, because you have that long strike that's 1 week out in time, and that's your insurance. That's the whole point of it. So it is a small amount of risk mitigation, but it's also, I think, a much larger motivation for it is consistency. Take that early assignment risk out of the equation, so now we can potentially have a smoother running, consistent machine. So the question then is begged. So what? For what? Because obviously on the earnings trades, we talk about in the calendar spread, the whole point is to harvest. I mean, in the calendar spread, but also in Sprocket's earnings trades, the whole point is to harvest elevated IV and elevated premium. So that doesn't seem like that's a thing in this particular strategy, because this is every day you're doing this. And so it's more of a statistics of large numbers, where it's because you're doing it every day, you're counting on the statistics of large numbers, the number of days that you're doing this, to pan out a profitable result. So essentially, and this is where I'm certainly going to throw some stuff out there, see if it makes sense to use Sprocket from your deeper understanding of options and Greeks and how it all behaves, specifically on that 1 DTE versus an 8 DTE as the long. But as I understand it, what is mostly being harvested here is the fact that specifically on the SPY, so this isn't something you would just do on any underlying, but specifically on the SPY, the 1 DTE options are generally being overpriced due to tail risk. So the market tends to short the tail risk. Hedge funds, I mean, these options are being bought up 1 DTE by a multitude of market participants, because it's one of the largest vehicles in the market. But I would say there's the participant that just wants to gamble, the people that just like that sex appeal of 1 DTE, anything could happen. I want to buy this, and the SPY goes nuts the next day, and now I'm just raking it in, because this is a huge product if it moves in your favor. So that's one market participant. The other market participant would be the giant hedge funds that they're just buying these things up to hedge other positions, to shore up other accounts, do their inventory of this, that, or the other. And so all of this kind of leads to a potential overpricing of 1 DTE options on the SPY. So that drives up that short price. Meanwhile, the 8 DTE has a potential that it is being underpriced, and the market is kind of giving that away by not properly pricing in that overnight gap risk of the SPY, where there's potentially a scenario now where we have the 1 DTE, which is going to just evaporate time decay. There's so little time decay left in there. And then when we get to day of expiration, the clock could not be ticking faster, depending on where price is. That short option is just evaporating very quickly, where I bought the 8 DTE, and I bought it at a time where the market was potentially underpricing it, which now works in my favor when I want to sell it to get rid of it, because volatility can expand intraday. And I think what I understood is the main takeaway here is the market does not do a good job at pricing in the volatility expansion after hours. The market is generally pricing in volatility expansion intraday. So the thesis is that 8 DTE is potentially underpriced, and then when we get to the next day, there's volatility expansion in the market, and now my 8 DTE it has intrinsic value, but it's also possibly expanding extrinsic value as that volatility expands in the following market day. So I think those are kind of the two driving factors. And I don't know how that hits you. Does that make sense? Or does any of that sound wrong or completely misguided?
No, it sounds pretty logical and reasonable. I can't say that I have a ton of experience paying attention to the overpriced, underpriced aspect of those particular days to expiration, but it does make sense, particularly on that short side of all the many people that are trying to gobble up those short-term DTEs, as it just seems to be a huge craze, meme craze and everything this year. I think there's a ton of buyers of those, and any time that you have any sort of market where you are overwhelmed with kind of demand, that's where it can drive up prices, right? If supply is low and you don't have enough sellers writing those contracts. As for the volatility expansion piece, I suppose that kind of makes sense. I don't ever really know that I've looked close enough. I mean, on in theory it does. I just know that some of that volatility increase has to be pretty decent to counteract the amount of theta decay that you're going to get. And I've not paid enough attention to those price points and those Greeks at that DTE to really have a educated perspective on that.
So I think that leads to the question of what, I guess it leads to the question of the question. What do you want to see out of a trade? Because I mean, I think that should be in the back of your mind on any trade, no matter what vehicle you're using. Like what do you look for? What do you think that's the thing? And so ultimately, we'll take a look at a chart in just a second. But ultimately, you what you're betting on, because you're doing this, like I said, every single day, that what you're betting on is you're betting on the fact that this major underlying will be not extremely volatile overnight, that it will not gap up more often than not. So you're essentially betting for flat or plus or minus 1 to 2%. And as long as we're in that range, then all the things that I kind of very roughly, probably terribly tried to highlight, all of those things come together, that as long as you're within that Goldilocks window of you can be a little volatile, but not too volatile. You can be up, but not too far up. You can be down, but not too far down. Then as long as all of that comes together, then you're flipping a profit and you're moving on and you're doing it again and you're doing it again and you're doing it again. And occasionally you get a giant gap because that's just what happens in the market. There's going to be weird things that happen overnight. And so as far as mechanics of how this thing works, like I said, you open it up just before market close, and then you're expiring the next day. So you kind of have two options on expiration day. You could use this strategy very legitimately as a cheap way to get long exposure to the SPY. And this is number one reason why I only take calls on this. I don't do this to the put side because the SPY is generally an up and to the right index. And so if the situation should arise that I can get a discounted long exposure, which I'll explain in just a second, then now I have a week for that to potentially go in the money. And that's not a scenario that I have enough data points to fully speak with any more authority on. But in theory, that's a week is a pretty decent amount of time for the SPY long option to get in the money. And then now that is one additional bonus avenue for profits. So let's take a quick look here at one of these trades, which turned out, I think, pretty well. So again, you can kind of see it on the chart. Let me just drop a couple boxes here. Well, just one box. This green box represents overnight hours. Just so you can see that, again, this is sort of what I kind of briefly touched on there with the market. This gap, this volatility that happens after hours is not something that was priced into the option. I'm going to move this box just so you can see my blue line. The blue vertical line is where I entered the trade. This volatility that happened overnight is not something that the market is able to price into the option when I open the trade. And I'm specifically talking about that long option that I bought. So something like this happens, there's volatility overnight. And now on open, we're pretty much near, we're slightly above where we were at close, but that long option is potentially now worth more because the market is now rapidly pricing in the volatility that happened. And so that helps me. Yeah, that helps my case. So in this particular case, let me drop a vertical line just so it's a little bit easier. I mean, a horizontal line, so it's a little bit easier to see. We were somewhere around this orange line as the price for the option. I do believe it was a $620. Now that I think about it, a $620 strike is what I took on this. So we open up the next day and we're pretty flat. You can see here midday going up into the lunch hour. We kind of ran up a little bit, but then we cooled off here into the afternoon. And at 2:45, I closed this thing out, and I closed it out for a couple reasons. One, it was in profit, so hooray! This was just one contract, and this particular trade at 2:45, the price was about $620.50. So we were only 50 cents in the money. Yes, 50 cents in the money. And this thing closed out for $30 profit. But I closed it out because we were in the money. So if we went to expiration, just a couple hours later, then I would have been assigned, and that's just not a scenario that I want to mess with. And at this close to the strike, I don't want to play around with gambling that we close the day out of the money, and then I get that discounted long exposure. So in this particular case, the strategy is if we're near the strike, dancing on in the money, then we just close it out, especially if we're in profit, because this is a daily grind. This is doing it every single day. If, price was down here at, like, say we just kept dumping on open here and, mid-afternoon, we're down at 618, 617, somewhere down there, then I'm just going to let it ride and let that short month expire worthless. And then I have that long exposure I was talking about, where I now have, from this particular day, I would have all the way until, let's see how that would have played out here. So I would have had all the way until here to get in the money if it was down there at 618. And so that's it. Like I said, that's a scenario that I'm okay with letting play out, because there is that probability of it moving into the money. And this could have been extremely profitable with that long exposure. But again, that's not the primary trade. That's just an opportunistic discretionary trade should the situation arise to get that discounted long exposure. So this is the scenario that I think you're shooting for 90% of these trades to be in, which is boom, boom, less than 24 hours. We harvest a small amount of profits. We harvest 10 to 15% of profit, and then we do it again, and then we do it again, and you just keep doing that. And then those other the other profit paths, those are, like I said, those are discretionary, opportunistic opportunities should the situation arise. But that's the general idea.
What paying in to buy this? Because you yielded $30 profit, but I think I missed what's the debit that you're paying to open this?
Yeah, good question, because super important to know what the cost is. So far, every time I've taken this, generally the debit is around. It's been as low as $240, and it's been as high as $330. So generally in that range. This particular trade was $314. Was the debit in, so roughly 10% return on that.
So what I did, maybe you haven't had enough of these trades to kind of know this, but when you are out of the money and you're saying you're going to keep on to your lotto ticket, do you know what you would recoup of that, as far as what would your loss be if you decided not to take the lotto ticket trade?
So what my loss? Okay, so if I closed it out of the money is basically what you're asking.
Yes.
Y-
Yes.
Yeah. So there's two ways. The very mechanical way to handle this, which I do like, and again, like you alluded to, it's just not something I've settled into yet because I don't have enough experience doing this. But this is where the liquidity of SPY is just a beautiful thing because it lets you do things like this, which is the most mechanical version of this strategy would be to say 20% is my profit target. So if I hit 20% profit, we close the whole thing out. Doesn't matter if it's 10 a.m. or 2:30 p.m. 20%, we close it out. Then the flip side would be if we're at 15% loss or 10% loss, where I found this strategy, they actually did 1-to-1. So it was 20% profit or 20% loss. Those were the exit criteria. And so to your question, it would basically be that where when it's moving out of the money, if you hit the stop loss criteria, whether it's 10, 15, 20%, you close it out. And so what I've experienced is in standard ticker options around earnings trades and stuff, like that level of granularity of like, okay, I don't want to exit at 10% loss, but I want to exit at 15%. That just doesn't exist. And I don't know if you've experienced that on typical options of just any underlying, or if it's just something that happens around earnings. That volatility is so wild. You can't peg that granular to your percentage profit or stop loss. But in this case, I very much have seen that consistently where it moves nice and steady, 5, 6, 7, 8% into profit, and then it declines very nice and steady. There's not wild whipsaw moves on it. So in general, I would say that I'm trying to drive towards a 10 to 15% stop loss criteria. And so where I would hold that lottery ticket would be if we were in, a 4 to 10% loss range, where I might say, okay, we're going to let this ride a little bit, throw in some price action, chart reading and whatnot, just to make sure that was advisable at that point.
Okay. I guess it makes sense. And I'm assuming that percentage stop loss would progress as basically for as long as the option's alive, such that if you held on to it at, 5% loss, even if it held that price, the theta decay would start increasing that in the following days to come. Would you still then keep that, 20% loss target to exit?
Yeah. I think so. I think that makes the most sense to be true to a system, because that is a very good point that, sure, maybe the price action says, you know what, this is an important level. We could hold support here, but you're holding a hot ticket. You're holding an out of the money option. And so that is not a favorable condition for holding support. You need a bounce of support. And so I think initially I'm going to try to err on the side of not playing those lottery tickets until there's an accumulation of profits, where then it's more discretionary based on like, okay, as a function of the realized profit, does it make sense? Can I risk this lottery ticket? Because these things on the underlying, I think that they can be on the order of, off the top of my head, I'm not exactly sure, but let's say $700 to $900. So that first one expired worthless. If I get that long one to expire worthless, that's a pretty hefty loss there. So I think to be methodical, I would play that into it.
That's where I was going with the questioning, to see how much you were putting in, because I think once you expand there, because you're not kind of keeping you're not really managing your losses, if by holding onto the lottery ticket, you could really outsize many sequential, $30 days.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a really important point for the calendar spread in general. And that's one of the key things I got bit early on. Position sizing, it wasn't a terrible bite, but it was a wake up call, where exactly what we just talked about, where what drew me to the calendar spread was this thing is so defined. It's like, you can't lose outside this range here. until you can. And one way you can is that short expires worthless, which the premium seller mindset would say that's perfect. That's exactly what I want. I want that to expire worthless. But it expires worthless, and now you got a red hot ticket on the other side, which now is going to very actively work against you. So the calendar spread works best, in my opinion, for a defined strategy when you just forget expiration ever exists and you say everything's going to be done before expiration, whether it's closing it out, whether it's taking profit, whatever it is. We're not going to mess with when things get messy when you approach expiration, or at least that's the next level of advancement of, when you have a super tight grasp on a system and you can very methodically open that door to that risk. But it is definitely the biggest thing about calendar spreads that is important to know. So I know in your options world, this is a very different option strategy. There's like in the Venn diagram, there is a tiny little overlap. So I'm curious, does that overlap resonate? I wouldn't expect you to want to just, jump into this and start doing it, but I'm curious from your much more experienced options mindset, how this particular strategy, either this one or the calendar spread in general, strikes you, or if it's still just kind of like, no, that's not my bag.
Well, the first thing, I guess, I don't know, you're supposed to start with the negatives or the praise first. I'm not sure. But I'll start with the praise first. The part that I really like is there's a mechanical methodology to it. And I think that's very, very important for any trading strategy. So I really do like that. I like that there's rules around it. I like that you can follow that and gain, a historical record to understand, hey, in practice, what does this really look like? So that's really awesome. And I 100% can get behind that. The two parts that I don't care for as much, and I've kind of tried the calendar spread a few times. Actually, this past week, right, the expiration of the IoT experiment, I basically took that thing to expiration, and because I didn't know what to do with it, so I just kind of took it and covered my assignment earlier because I was still long the other one. But that's the part that I don't care for in the calendar spread is I feel the probability of profit is not as much in your favor as other option strategy. And what do I mean by that? So what do I always say about selling options? Selling options is wonderful because you can make profit in 2 out of 3 directions. You profit if the stock goes up, you profit if it goes nowhere, and you only lose money if it goes way down, right? Or depending on which direction you take, basically you'll profit in 2 of the 3 directions. Notably, you will profit if the thing goes nowhere. With the calendar spread, your maximum profit, your best chance is if it goes nowhere, is my understanding. Is it really looks, the P&L looks very much like a sharp pyramid. It's almost kind of like a straddle. And that's the part. Now, it's not 100% like that because you get this other dimension, which is the second thing I don't like, and that's the confusing part of the other dimension. But if let's just stick with you really serves best, and you even said it, like if you don't move much. If you move up real far or down real far, both cases are not good for your situation. And that I feel is taking away from one of the core benefits of selling option. And that's that, 2 out of 3 ain't bad type of scenarios. The added dimension that I'm talking about, that's the part that I suppose if I did it more or understood it more, it feels like it's an extra variable to watch and control that is kind of hard to track for me. I view it, if I were to draw an analogy, you got those toasters, those conveyor toaster belts. And I've always been perplexed by those because they have 2 settings on them that you can change. You can change the conveyor speed or you can change the toaster setting. Well, if you want toastier toast, you could either turn up the element and leave the conveyor speed fast, or you could leave the element the same and slow the conveyor belt down. Both of them would have the same end result. So which is better? I don't know. And I get just confused by that. And I feel like that's kind of that other dimension of that expiration where you kind of, you got this option going on this expiration, but then you got this other time delta, and my brain doesn't process it very well.
Yeah. So a couple of things that I would say is one, is it entirely fair to compare it to selling options, strictly selling options? Because the whole reason that one of the things I heard that you don't particularly care for is the protection. So it seems like some of what you don't like applies to any spread where there's a protection element. Would you say that's true?
No, 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 no. I don't think so. But what your point is correct. Is it fair to compare it to just naked selling? No, not. That's completely it is different, right? But even a vertical still wins in two of three directions. So it's not necessarily naked that you have to play for the two of three directions.
Okay. So, I see.
And
So
technically,
in the vertical, you do have a protection leg, but you're protecting one extreme case, and you're actually profiting in the other extreme.
yeah, or nowhere,
Yeah,
going
or
nowhere
nowhere.
because you're selling out of the money.
Okay.
But you're going at the money. Now, the other point of is selling a fair comparison? No, it's not, because you're not selling. You have a debit, right? You're a net debit. You're buying an option. So that's the other part. You're right. It's not, but it's what I typically do. So for me, that's why it's a harder transition to compute all this.
Yeah. There are, which I have not experimented with, and I don't know if I'll ever get there, but I'll never say never. There are credit calendar spreads, but my very, very limited understanding is that those are even more specific in their profit scenario. So I think the other thing I wanted to say was I don't necessarily disagree with a lot of what you said, that it is a tight window. I don't even want to say tight window. It is just a defined window, especially on this SPY trade where, like I said, it's the Goldilocks zone of when this thing works. So maybe I would more akin it to like an iron condor or something where you are very defined on that diddle down the middle thing. But the other thing that I wanted to say is that one of the things, well, if I were to, as I've learned about the calendar spread, if I were to pick something that I would have thought or still think would interest you, it would be the fact that, or I would challenge you to think of the calendar spread not necessarily from how do I profit on the price of the underlying, but I feel like, and definitely let me know if this is not true, if you find plenty of exposure to this in other strategies, but I feel like this opens up the ability to play specifically to the Greeks. That because you have the same strike on the short and the long, again, within that percentage move, you're kind of saying, I don't care about the price, within a reasonable tolerance here. What I'm really trying to do, and this goes more to the earnings implementation of the calendar spread, but what I'm really trying to do is I'm trying to seize the Greeks and kind of capitalize on some arbitrage with the Greeks or something to that effect. I don't have a full strategy around that other than what I do for earnings, but that was kind of one mechanic of the calendar spread that struck me, is it kind of gives you more stability to go after specific Greeks.
Yeah, I don't know that I am quite familiar enough with the mechanics of the Greeks of a calendar spread. But what I am kind of familiar with is what the pricing curve of at the money really looks like as you really get close to expiration. And I think that's really kind of what we're focusing on or dealing with here with the calendar spread. And so there is, I think you might have found a P&L chart here of the calendar spread. I'm going to switch over to that P&L chart to kind of show you. And this is the P&L at expiration. And what that looks like is really like a tent, a pyramid right at the money. And where I think this kind of comes in, because you are paying a debit to open this thing. And before you get to expiration, underneath that tent, if you can think of like a small molehill kind of bump there on the ground. So the ground would be your zero axes on that chart. And there would be a really kind of mound that would be over about the zero axis on the Y. X equals 0, there would be kind of a mound centered about that. And then what basically happens as the option approaches expiration, the pricing of that is almost like somebody grabs the center of that molehill and stretches it up right on that X equals 0 up the Y axis. And it basically starts to form a sharper and sharper pyramid. And so depending on where you entered on that kind of bump, right, that bump becomes extended upwards, and you're basically profiting on the difference between where that lower bump was and then as you approach expiration, that kind of stretch up. And I'm guessing that probably has to do with the difference in theta from the front month to the back month and volatility, because those are the real price drivers of an option are kind of your theta time decay and amount of volatility. So if you get a volatility bump and time is passing, that's going to, I believe, increase the difference between that front and back month, and I think that's what's going to give you kind of that stretch. So I guess that's kind of where I feel like it's at. And I just think it goes back to that difference of a credit and debit difference, where a lot of times when you're taking a debit for an option, you're probably dealing with a one-dimension profitability, means, stocks go up, down, or nowhere. So you would profit in one of the three directions, where a lot of times if you're taking a credit, whatever it is you're trading, you're probably ending up profiting in two of the three directions. But it's all about consistency. It's all about repeatability. Time will tell how this works out. So that brings us to the end of this week's episode. Just a touch there on kind of a new mechanical strategy and how Viper's gone about it. We'll keep tabs on this because I think it would be really cool to kind of see a myriad of these charts, or these trades taken in a chart, kind of like Viper was putting together for a lot of his earnings trades. Earnings season's right around the corner. Hopefully Viper, dabbles in earnings a bit more to vet out that chart, see if the new liquidity of this new broker kind of impacts those. And then right alongside that, if we kind of plot out the results of these SPY trades at whatever frequency Viper takes them, I think that would really help kind of solidify or understand what it does in practice when it comes to those things. So good luck out there. Hopefully you're finding things. Earnings really starts ramping up, and we will go through probably 6 to 8 weeks of solid earnings options to trade. So good luck, have fun, and remember, think outside the block.